In the world of television and pop music, friends are number one. But in the world that many of us live in, friends drop to 2 or 3 or even lower, behind family and work and other commitments. And in this second decade of the 21st century, the notion of friend has become really confusing. Who are all those people who want to be my friend on Facebook? I have no idea who they are. Friend? Really? And what about those populist leaders that are emerging across Europe, South America? We see them south of the border in the United States, emerging here in our own province and in other parts of our country. Those populist leaders who say again and again to the common working man, and yes, I am being intentional with that gender-specific reference, they keep saying to the common working man, I'm not just a friend, I'm your best friend. You can trust me. Friend? Really? And then we come to church on Sunday morning and we hear the lectionary reading, our friend Wayne Hilliker standing and reading from the Gospel of John, and we hear Jesus say, "You are my friends. I have called you friends." Jesus, our friend? Really? Jesus as teacher, that makes sense. Jesus as healer, that makes sense. Jesus as friend? Really? Now, if Joseph Scriven were here today, this is the point when he would jump up and start to say to all of us, haven't you people sung my hymn? In 1855, he wrote the words to "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." It began as a poem he was sending home to his mother, who was living in Ireland while he was living here in Ontario. And this long, beloved hymn does speak to us about Jesus being our friend. But for many of us, the understanding of friendship has become challenging, even problematic. On the one hand, there's us human beings. We're carrying sins and trials and tribulations, griefs and weaknesses. That's us on this side of the friendship equation. And over here is Jesus, bearing our burdens, carrying our load, paying our price. That's one way of understanding friendship with the divine. We hear something different this morning in the Gospel of John. As John lifts up being friend, befriending, the way Jesus talked about it and lived it, we are presented with an understanding of friendship that is complex, that has many, many strands. 3 stand out. We hear them all in this reading: compassion, hospitality, and gratitude. Clearly, on this final night of his life, in his final conversation with his dear friends, Jesus is filled with compassion for them and what they're going through. It's no surprise, compassion was the mark of Jesus' life and ministry from the very beginning. And from the very beginning, it was his call to those gathered around them: be compassionate with all those you encounter. Compassion, core to Jesus being friend, befriending. And then there's hospitality. John clearly presents Jesus as the host figure, washing everyone's feet and then standing, speaking with urgency and authority. But here's the thing. John and the other gospel writers describe Jesus as often as a guest as a host. Think of all those times Jesus showed up at the home of his friends Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus. The way in which, when he went to Simon Peter's house, he was quite happy to sit down and enjoy the supper that Peter's mother-in-law made for him after he healed her of a fever. And remember Zacchaeus up there in the tree? Jesus is going by, looks up and says, "Zacchaeus, come down. I've got to go to your house today." Jesus knew how to be a guest and a host, and in Jesus being friend befriending, what we see is a reciprocity, a mutuality that invites us to move between being guest and host, between offering and receiving. And then there's gratitude. Now, you don't hear Jesus explicitly saying thank you in that final discourse, but it's there. It's there between the lines. It's there in the spaces between the words. You can hear it. You can see it. Jesus' gratitude for God, for God's love. Jesus' gratitude for all those that were with him. Jesus' gratitude for all that they had shared together. Jesus was a person of gratitude. Now, that's a tough strand for many of us. Diana Butler Bass found gratitude so difficult that she decided to research and write a book about it. The book was published last month. It's called Grateful. And what she acknowledges right in the beginning is the eons understanding of gratitude that crossed culture and region and religion. The understanding that gratitude was about a series of transactions between benefactor and beneficiary that carried obligations to repay a debt or a favor, a gift or a favor. And from the time she was a young girl, Diana Butler Bass said she resisted being stuck in the role of beneficiary. And it was confusing what her church taught her, and it was a lesson many of us heard as well. It's far more blessed to give than to receive. You want to be on the side of the benefactors. However, when you're human living in this earthly world, it's God who's the benefactor. And as human, you only ever get to be the beneficiary, always expected to give thanks again and again and again. That's what many of us think when we contemplate gratitude. Diana Butler Bass, in her research, realized that gratitude does not have to be a closed system of debt and dependence. There's another way to understand gratitude. Here's a little bit of what she writes. We can change that closed system to being an open system. We can banish transaction and substitute it with grace. In an open cycle of gratitude, Gifts are not commodities. Gifts are the nature of the universe itself, given by God or the natural order. Grace reminds us that every good thing is a gift. And then we understand that all benefactors are also beneficiaries, and all beneficiaries can be benefactors. All that we have is gift to us. Gifts come before givers. We don't really give gifts. We recognize gifts. We receive them. We pass them on. We all rely on them. We all share them. It's not fulfillment of duty. It's an infinite process of awareness and responsive action. The gift structure of the universe is that of an interdependent community, a community of nature and neighbor that's handed down to us so we can gift others in response. It is not a closed cycle of exchange. It's more like circles that ripple across a pond when a pebble is tossed. And when we see everything as gift, gratitude is inevitable. Gratitude is appropriate. There's a lot more in this book, but I will put it aside for now. Gratitude, hospitality, compassion, they're all part of being friend, befriending, and you can't separate the strands and treat befriending as one single strand that's so fragile, that can so easily be broken. No. Compassion, hospitality, and gratitude that are far more verb than noun. They are constantly bending and braiding around each other, flowing and moving, so that in and through being friend and befriending, there is so much more strength. Imagine this. Imagine you are on the verge of compassion burnout, or maybe you're in the midst of compassion burnout. You've been walking with someone who's living with a terminal illness. You've been supporting someone in the middle of a financial crisis. You've been pouring your heart and soul into a movement that you know is going to make this world a better place. And you wake up one day and you are exhausted. You're done. There's nothing left. You don't know how you're going to make it through the day. Well, the telephone rings, or maybe it's a buzz from a text message, and a friend is inviting you over for a cuppa. Now, you don't have time, you don't have energy, but it is your friend, and so you drag yourself to their house. You walk in the door, you collapse in a chair, and your friend brings you a steaming mug with just the right amount of cream, no sugar. And what's that in the other hand? Freshly baked treats? Your friend's specialty, your favorite? Offered to you. And you talk. And then you hear something you haven't heard for a long time. You hear yourself laughing. And you look over at your friend. And you notice Is that relief in their eyes? And you realize they know what's going on. They care about what's happening. They're reaching out because you mattered to them. And you feel your shoulders relax, and you know that burden isn't gone, but it sure does feel lighter. And you just can breathe a little more deeply, and you sit up a little taller, and you begin to feel something in your heart that you haven't felt for a long time. You begin to feel grateful. And there it is, happening again. Compassion, hospitality, gratitude, moving, braiding, dancing together. And you realize that you're going to make it through this day and probably tomorrow as well. When gratitude, compassion, and hospitality, and all the other strands that are part of being friend and befriending, when these move together, then we as individuals and we in community find ourselves more flexible, more resilient, more durable. We find ourselves more hopeful. Now, here's the thing. Being befriending does not happen automatically. It involves choice. We heard Jesus say it, I chose you. And the being befriending that Jesus engaged in, well, it just created a kind of chosen family. And I know that there are many today for whom their dear, dear friends who make up their chosen family actually make more of a difference in their lives than their biological family. The thing is, our chosen families have a way of growing. That Jesus community before Easter, that kept growing. And then after Easter, the Jesus movement kept growing, grew into the church that through all manner of being friend and befriending expanded and extended across Asia and Africa, Europe, and beyond. But there's something we have to be absolutely clear about, especially as our chosen family becomes bigger and bigger. The people in our chosen family aren't necessarily going to be like us, and we're not necessarily going to like them. In fact, the bigger the chosen family, the more likelihood that there's going to be tension, conflict, even estrangement. And when human beings get to that point, it's all too easy for them, for us, to look at one another and see enemy. Now, our friend Norm Esden had a very interesting insight into the word enemy. He pondered it for a while, and then he brought it to a study group that was going on a few years ago. He brought it to the group and shared it in this poster. Can you see what he noticed about the word enemy? Takes a moment or two to see it. What Norm noticed is that the word enemy is embedded in exactly the right order in the words estranged family. And this poster, this insight of norms, presents us with a choice, another choice. We can choose to see others as enemy. We can choose to be afraid of them, to reject them, to harm them. We can choose to kill them. Or we can choose to see those people as part of our estranged family. And if that's what we see, then we can choose to be about being friend, befriending them. Now, these days, the enemy is being talked a lot about in private conversation, in public discourse. We're living in increasingly polarized and polarizing times. And so the call to being friend, befriending can seem confusing. And there are those who are going to try to convince us that with so many enemies out there in the world, being friend, befriending is impractical, imprudent, impossible. What do you think Jesus would say? There's a legend that explores this very question. I heard it recently from Madeline L'Engle in Bread and Wine, Reflections for Lent and Easter. She heard the legend from her son-in-law, who's an ordained minister, and he actually told this legend to a group of clergy at a conference in the States. The legend is about Judas, who, according to the gospel writer Matthew, after betraying Jesus, went out and hung himself. The legend picks up the story at this point. Judas, after death, finds himself in a very deep, dark pit, and he starts to cry. He's crying tears of shame, tears of guilt, tears of remorse. Eventually, he cries tears of repentance. Oh, what he wouldn't give to turn things around. He cries, and that pit, that dark pit, becomes slimy and slippery. But something in Judas just pulls him. And so he starts to climb up, but he slides right down. He falls into the muck. He tries again and again, getting a little bit higher. And the higher he goes, he starts to see light at the top of that pit. And eventually, covered in tears and muck and mud, eventually he gets to the top of the pit. He climbs onto the land. He has no idea where he is. He can barely see clearly, but there's something inside. And so he chooses just to walk. And he walks, and he walks, and he walks, and he keeps walking. And he finally comes to a house. And he goes up to the house, looks inside, and he sees a group of people sitting around a circular table. And there's somebody with his back to him, somebody who's standing and talking. And Judas stops. And the person turns around, sees Judas, and then decides, then chooses to wave Judas in. And when Judas gets a little closer, extends a hand, and looking right into Judas' eyes, speaking with a warm and welcoming voice, says, "Judas, my friend, you're finally here. Come, take your place at this table." We won't start without you. We can't start without you. Jesus, in his life and ministry, made clear. And the Gospels have kept repeating this generation after generation. And we've actually witnessed it and experienced it in a whole lot of different ways. Jesus made so very clear that being friend, befriending, is possible, even in the most horrific, harrowing circumstances. It's possible. And you and I, my friends, we're being called right now to do all that we can. No matter what else is happening in our lives, no matter what else is demanding our attention or occupying our time, we are being called to show the world, to show ourselves, but to show the world that being friend, befriending, is possible. And we do that when we share compassion, hospitality, gratitude with and for one another, with and for the world. After all, we've been blessed to be among the ones who are called, who are chosen to be friends. And that's what friends are for. Amen. Our hymn is 603, "In Loving Partnership."
Partnership, we come, seeking
being friend, becoming friend, befriending, this becomes real, makes a difference in the world when we share something of who we are and what we have in support of the life and ministry of our congregations, in support of the mission of the wider United Church of Canada. So I invite us to give generously and joyfully. Let us present our offerings to